Good morning and welcome to this chapter of the history of the BBC, and this is number 3 on the history of the BBC chronologically before 1945, although it's actually video number 8. I was somewhere in the middle of I was somewhere in the 1930s, and I'm going to continue with the 1930s today, including one or two things which I may have mentioned already. But 1933, it wasn't so much an event, but it was the beginning of a long process and a long and controversial process, because this was the first time that a BBC executive got into the habit of meeting with MI5, with the head of MI5, so it was obviously taken very seriously by the intelligence service, and the idea was to check if the BBC was not recruiting people who might have communist sympathies. And these arrangements were initially informal, but they became formal 2 years later, and there was an agreement between the BBC and MI5, a secret agreement that all new staff should be vetted, and the fear was that evilly disposed engineers might sabotage the network in the name of communism. And so routine vetting began, and this continued for a very long time indeed, and was completely secret until 1989. Now, the director generals of the BBC even sometimes went as far as to lie in interviews about this, and I think I mentioned this in the history of the director generals. So this fact is support to the argument of those people who consider the BBC to be more establishment than impartial. So what else was going on in the 1930s? Well, you can see here the stand from the Olympia exhibition in 1933, and I just wanted to show you this, just to show you how exciting and new radio appeared to be. You can see that huge stand with there's a tenor all over the place. They're obviously being very exciting and spectacular about it, and I think this is an important point. Not just that they thought it was spectacular; it was spectacular. Everybody's lives were being slowly transformed by radio. By 1934, you have many millions of listeners, and it was giving them access to something which was completely new and enormously wider than anything they'd had access to in the past. And indeed, this was rapidly shown in the popularity of the BBC's main publication, the Radio Times. Here you have the Radio Times from 1934. And interestingly enough, you can see that on the front page, one of the major interests is the position of women within society. That is to say that when women got the right to vote at the same age as men in 1928, this was part of an atmosphere in the nation which recognized that it was appropriate for women to do many more things than they used to be able to do, but it also opened up an enormous public and popular debate about, what was the right role of women then? And indeed, the women's programs on the radio took up this, where they weren't sure, should we have radio programs for women to help them keep home, to help them do the housework and so on, bring up children, or should we have radio programs for women which give them much wider view of the world? And this, oh dear, this piece, this is also from 1934. And I'd shown this to some of you, and this is a map of the percentage of people who have radio licenses. And so you can see that in London and the South, you get up to 17 or 20% of people. So that's probably, over 50% of people with access to it, because one license, of course, is for the whole family. But what is interesting about this particular map is it shows that there are parts of the country which are slower in take-up. Look, Scotland 8%, Wales 9%. So it's still just coming into public consciousness in these parts of the country. Although I don't have information about the exact reasons that the more rural places should be behind, whether it was a matter of paying for it or a matter of lack of interest within people who lived in villages. I have no idea. 1934, then 1934 was also an important, well, this is a very dangerous or very spectacular times politically. In 1934, there was an attempt by the far right to take over governments. So there was a very, very high level of social tension across Europe. But 1934 in the BBC's history is when the BBC News Service was established for the first time. Yes, perhaps you'll remember that at the beginning, the BBC were only allowed to summarize what was in the newspapers, and they weren't allowed to hire journalists and make news, and now they were. Although it was very modest at the beginning, it was helped along by the invention in the early 1930s of relatively portable recording machines. These are huge things, but nevertheless it was possible to record, and they used from 1933 on, I think they used recording discs. Each one lasted 9 minutes, and so obviously with more recording, it became possible to bring in news from around the country much more easily. Now, the debate was permanent on what sort of things were appropriate to put on the radio. More and more, the hours were getting longer. There was more and more radio programs on, but what was right? And from the point of view of information and education, John Reith had always considered that only people with a special claim to be heard should be on the television. That is to say, he thought it was inappropriate to have the man in the street or the housewife speaking on the radio. He thought that the radio was for experts. That's the people we wanted to listen to. And not everybody agreed with him, and some more left-wing people within the BBC would quite like to have had a wider and more popular, their critics would say populist, approach to radio. And one of these was Archie Harding. Now, Archie Harding had produced a rather controversial program in December 1933 about Poland and its military expenditure, and the Polish ambassador had been offended, and as a result, John Reith told him to pack his bags and go and be responsible for some of the work in the north of England. He said, Reith said, "I think you'd be better off in the north where you can't do so much damage." In any case, Harding was programme director in the north, and he gathered a more left-wing team around him, including Joan Littlewood, tremendously well known for doing radical theatre, very radical theatre, some of which is still looked at today, Olive Shapley, so two women there, and Geoffrey Bridson, who I don't know much around. But they produced some slightly different kinds of programmes, and showed that it was sometimes possible to have a radical voice on the BBC. For example, Olive Shapley worked with Geoffrey Bridson to make a programme where they had miners from Durham. Remember, at the time, there were almost 1 million miners in Britain. It's huge, or maybe it's only 600,000 now, but an enormous number of miners in any case. And they invited miners to come to the radio studio to talk about their work. And so this obviously was quite a radical idea, the idea that ordinary people have valuable things to say. And there was some amusing stories about that, because Olive Shapley had to stand in the studio with a piece of cardboard where the miners could see it, saying, "Do not say bugger or bloody," because they had to be careful that the miners did not use everyday vernacular language, which would not be acceptable to the BBC management. And indeed, after that program in London, the BBC management decided that all discussions should be scripted, so that they should all be written out beforehand. Bridson, so going back to what they were doing in this northern, more radical program making adventure, they produced a program, for example, called Coal in 1938, and he spent a month living and working with miners to see what it was like. And so Olive Shapley herself used the recording van in 1937 around Manchester in the north to capture the words of working class men and women in their own homes, because they discovered, which is something which everybody in sociology knows now, and that is that people say different things if you ask them questions in their own homes than if you take them into a rather posh recording BBC studio. That was some of what was going on in the North. These were, however, exceptions. It was exceptional that working class men and women should be on the radio, but this was a sign that sometimes, or one might say occasionally, the BBC has had space for radical people to make programs, or perhaps we should say that radical people have managed to find ways of making programs on the BBC. The other two examples which come immediately to mind are the radio ballads of the 1960s, of Ewan MacColl and Peggy Seeger, and the Wednesday plays of the 1970s. There's an article about the Wednesday plays in the Revue Française de Civilisation Britannique, which I highly recommend, and which is free online. Also in the 30s, one of the changes which was going on is that one of John Reith's principles of how to organize radio programming was changing slowly. He began with the principle that there should not be a fixed program schedule. That is to say that if you listen to a classical music program one week on a Tuesday at 5 o'clock, it should not be at the same time the following week. It should be at a different time. And the aim of this was went along with John Reith's idea of raising the cultural level of the masses, that he didn't want people to just tune into their favorite programs, because they might just tune into the popular music programs and not be interested in opera. He wanted to surprise them. He wanted the people to come home and say, oh, well, I want to listen to the radio tonight, and put on the radio and discover what was on. And in this way, he hoped to cajole people into discovering content which normally they would not have done. Now, the BBC was the only broadcaster in the world to use this method, and it was slowly relaxed during the 1930s. Nevertheless, the principle remained, and as John Reith very clearly put it, he said, the BBC must lead, not follow its listeners. So it's an absolutely fascinating way of looking at the world. But the complete quote is, the BBC must lead, not follow its listeners, but it must not lead at so great a distance as to shake off pursuit. That is to say that if you were going to introduce people to classical music or opera, you mustn't begin with the most difficult operas and the most difficult pieces of classical music. You must be able to cajole your audience towards these things. This whole idea is rather parallel to Christian ideas, perhaps. And of course, John Reith was very much a devout Christian. It's this idea that if you leave human beings to themselves, if you leave human beings to choose, they will wander off into sin or irresponsible pleasure, which is something that obviously both the Church of England and the BBC did not want people to do. Nevertheless, this view of the mass of the people is more progressive than some conservative press outlets at the time, who laughed at the idea that working class people could be educated beyond the basics. So when John Reith says, working class people should listen to opera, he is both being conservative in saying, I know what is good for you and you do not, and he's also being progressive in saying that all human beings, working class people and other people, are capable of understanding cultural forms which they are not familiar with. So the whole question of the rise of the democratic spirit against the idea of immutable class hierarchy is present here in all its complexity. 1936 is an important date because it's the very first time that audience research is carried out by the BBC. Now, John Reith was rather hostile to the idea. However, it must be remembered that even though the BBC had very little competition to deal with the exception of a couple of radio stations in France, this does not mean that they could program without any reference to public opinion. The BBC was paid for with taxpayers' money, and the popular press did not hesitate to say if it thought this money was being badly used. and you have here a picture of the tuner's questionnaire. So this is what's the word? Well, it's a questionnaire. What kind of programs do you like on the wireless? And so here you have the beginnings of a shift to the idea that what listeners think is important, rather than John Reed's position, which was very few people know what they like, and even fewer what they need. So this was the beginning of a more, it depends if you're in favour. If not, if you're in favour, you say a more democratic approach to the BBC programming, and if you're against, you say a more populist approach. In November 1936, the BBC opened the world's first regular high-definition television service from Alexandra Palace in London. And you have behind me, if you're wondering what that is, this is a 1938 combined radio-television machine set. Okay. And so there you go. And here we have a statue, a bust of John Logie Baird, who introduced then, who invented a way of transmitting moving pictures at a distance, television, although in the when they got the television service going for the BBC, they eventually decided on another technical standard and not on John Logie Baird's, and so they lost out on that one. Throughout the 20s and 30s, then the BBC is rising extremely rapidly, growing extremely rapidly, I should say. So you can see there we have the statistics. I didn't want to take every year because then you'll just forget it. So I just take 3 key years. 1926, just over 2 million licenses and almost 800 staff. 1936, 10 years later, 3,350 staff. Almost 8 million licenses. So you can see what we're talking about is explosive growth of something which is transforming politics, but it's also transforming people's everyday life. And I think that the idea of the enchantment of everyday life is extremely important. The life of housewives, but also of workers who were in places where they could listen to the radio while they were at work, was transformed, was really transformed. And by 1939, then you can see we have 9 million licenses. Obviously, I've chosen 1939 because it's the beginning of the Second World War, and 5,200 staff. Now although you have another early television set, although it's probably worth reminding you at this point that if you were to buy a television in the mid 1930s or the late 1930s, first of all, it would be extremely expensive. I mean, several months' wages, I think, is what we're talking about. And secondly, there are only 2 or 3 hours programs every day, because it's good they don't have the resources to make more of them. Now, I seem to have actually lost one of my slides, but there you go. In any case, the BBC was importantly present in a big constitutional crisis in 1936. After the previous king died, King Edward VII, was on the throne, and he had this idea that he wanted to marry the love of his life, Wallis Simpson, who was not yet divorced, who was married to somebody else. Now, the king being the head of the Church of England, it seemed to be rather difficult to allow the king to marry somebody who was divorced, and indeed was not even yet divorced. Much of the British establishment disapproved anyway of an American queen, and also this particular lady, or perhaps I should say woman, was well known to be sympathetic to Nazi Germany and to Hitler, and indeed so was Edward VII. In any case, it was on a knife edge for a long time. It wasn't clear if he was going to insist or not, and eventually he gave an abdication speech on the radio, on the BBC radio. Fascinating story. I mean, we've recently got the hold of the text of the speech that he didn't give, the speech where he insisted that he had to marry this person. in any case, it was clear that any major national or international crisis from now on would involve broadcasting in a big way. And indeed, right up to today, things like 9/11 or indeed the coronavirus epidemic have been transformed by the fact that we have news so quickly and so frequently. If we move on to 1937, we get the very first children's television show, and indeed the very first use of a television outside broadcast van to cover the procession of the coronation of King George VI. Also television coverage of the tennis at Wimbledon for the very first time, and a change, if we come back to radio, a change in the organisation of BBC programmes for Wales. Until this point, Wales had been part of the West Region, which actually included parts of England. And this was absolutely infuriating to Welsh nationalists and indeed to many other Welsh people who considered that being Welsh was a national identity, and therefore that just being lumped in with the west of England was unacceptable. Many listeners in England were also in favour of there being a separate region for Wales, since they did not feel concerned by some of the programmes which were in Welsh. Although mostly about Wales and not in Welsh. And so that was a change. And indeed, in 1937, the Welsh region began. And this is tremendously important because once they had a national radio station for Wales, this was of a nature to encourage the gradual rise in a strong Welsh national identity. And indeed, the rise of Welsh national identity is one of the major processes in Britain over the last 100 years, leading to the establishment of the Welsh Assembly in the late 1990s and its strengthening in the 21st century. 1938, the BBC begins broadcasting its first foreign language service in Arabic. And we have an article on the BBC Arabic service in our Revue Française de Civilisation Britannique. Yes, this is a bit of an advertising break, but I don't really apologise because although I am the editor of this review, it's completely free online, so I'm not making any money out of this. 1938 is also the moment when they began the BBC European service, broadcasting in French, German, German and Italian. And the following year they will add Portuguese and Spanish. So again, this is a major difference that the BBC was beginning to get a world reputation and was determined to make sure this helped the interest, the imperial, colonial, and other interests of the British states, in particular, since the Second World War was not a complete surprise. Of course, nobody was certain there would be a war, but it did look like international tension was huge. So final note about the BBC before the war. The BBC was also already becoming one of the major employers of musicians in the country, employed 400 full-time musicians. 1938 is also important for one last reason, and that is that this is the moment when John Reith left the BBC, who had such a huge influence on its growth, its sense of adventure, its innovation, and also its paternalism. Now, John Reith left a little bit under a cloud in the sense that he would have liked to have helped choose his successor, but he was not allowed to. He would have liked to have remained on the board of governors, but this was not accepted. So he was rather disappointed when he left. This may have been because he was, let's say, a powerful personality. Some people said a dictator. And so, perhaps the board of governors thought it would be difficult to operate with him in a minor role. 1939, of course, only 20 years after the end of the First World War, we have the beginning of the Second World War, which is tremendously traumatic for everybody involved, and will see massive massacres across Europe. The Russian people, I think, will lose almost 20 million people. The Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and communists will be wiped out in extremely large numbers, and so on. I'm not going to give you a lot of details of the Second World War for a reason I'll come come to it in a minute. But during his role as Prime Minister during the Second World War, he was not Prime Minister at the beginning of the Second World War, he became Prime Minister, and he was to deliver 33 major wartime speeches by radio, all of which were, of course, broadcast by the BBC. And this allowed the Prime Minister to have a link with the people of a type which had never been seen before. In the First World War, this was not possible, to have this impression that the Prime Minister was sitting in the corner of your living room and talking to you. And Winston Churchill's speeches are masterpieces of rhetoric and conviction, and also very, very different from the First World War speeches. First World War speeches tended to talk about the glory of war and of victory. By the Second World War, the experience of the First World War had made it impossible to talk like that, and this is why Winston Churchill is known for emphasizing, "I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, something else, tears and sweat," I think. The BBC, of course, was also important in 1940, and the possibility to listen to the BBC even when you were in France, of course, is crucial, because it's on the 18th of June that Charles de Gaulle, in exile, makes his speech urging the French people not to capitulate to the Nazis. I'm not going to say any more about that, because I'm sure you know. Now, before the Second World War began, John Reith had agreed with the British government what kind of censorship they would use in case of a war. First of all, it was very strictly watched over. Nothing could be added to any of the news bulletins. The news bulletins were validated, and then they had to stay that way. And so, for example, when the BBC was broadcasting abroad to Poland, the news was heavily censored because of fears of jeopardizing relations with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, being a major ally of the British at the time. So, for example, the contested Polish and Soviet border, the deportation of Polish citizens by the Soviet state, and the Katyn massacre, which I have were not included in Polish broadcast. Or the Katyn massacre, you may not know about. It's a horrible event where 20,000 military officers and others from Poland were executed by Stalin's army. And here you can see that the memorial shows somebody being stabbed in the back. Yeah, that they were supposed to be on the same side, but they were treated very badly. Other less shocking forms of censorship were present, for example, in music. Music by composers from enemy nations was censored. 99 German, 38 Austrian, and 38 Italian composers were censored. Also, any potential broadcaster said to have pacifist or communist or fascist ideas were not allowed to broadcast on the BBC. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because there's been so much written about it, and I do recommend this this article in the Revue Bissa for the people who are listening to me from France, which is almost everybody, about hidden propaganda in the BBC. And this is very, very important because it gives you a more sophisticated view of how propaganda works. It's not just a matter of saying things which are not true. And indeed, radio stations have to be very careful, because if they simply continue saying things which are not true, what they get as a result is nobody believes them anymore. The BBC was much more intelligent than that, and this article really has to be seen. It's free online, or otherwise I wouldn't be recommending it for you. Now, note that during the Second World War, even though Churchill was regularly unhappy with particular aspects of the BBC, there was no longer any real question of the government taking over direct control of the BBC. The BBC was trusted by the government. So unlike in 1926 and afterwards, there wasn't the question of being taken over. The television service was completely suspended during the war, partly because they were worried that the transmissions, that the waves used for the transmission on VHF would help enemy aircraft find the cities to bomb them, and also because those technicians and engineers involved in the television service were needed in the army, in particular, to work on the development of radar, which was probably the reason that Britain won the air fight over the English Channel. Meanwhile, on the radio, the national and regional programs were combined to form a single home service. And the home service, I'm pretty sure it was on the home service, was the place for the launching of a particularly popular new comedy program called It's That Man Again, which is rather crazy humor, very good timing, although not easy to listen to today. You can find on YouTube an example program, not easy to listen to today because our humor has changed. But basically the story was that Tommy Handley in the centre, a fast-talking figure, undertook a series of fictional, bizarre jobs. So he began by working on a radio station, and then he began to work at he began to work as Minister of Aggravation and Mysteries at the Office of Twerps. Twerps means idiots. So it's a slightly, one is often tempted with the word surrealist, which is probably not the right word. The timing and punning are of high quality, but as I say, many of the jokes have dated somewhat. The radio, and in particular music on the radio, was transformed because they were particularly keen to keep the members of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy happy with their broadcasts, and in particular, whereas the management of the BBC was very much interested in raising people up and getting them to listen to opera and classical music, suddenly, now there was a war on, the government were not interested in that. They just wanted to keep people happy. So they became responsive to the public because now they needed to keep people happy and entertained and supported. And this meant much more popular music. In particular, British soldiers in North Africa were slowly discovering, when they found the BBC rather too boring and rather too much based on classical music, they found out that they had an alternative. They could listen to the German radio, which was broadcast in English with lots of popular music. So as you can imagine, the management of the BBC, who had been very slowly accepting a little bit more popular music, were told by the government to completely change their programming because, of course, having your soldiers listening to the enemy radio station because the music is better is obviously very, very bad news indeed. Here you can see the front page of the Radio Times from the beginning of the war, and you can see a very, very classic caricature there. You can see how happy the soldiers are, how happy the sailors are. That must be what it's like in a war, I guess. And one of the most important innovations then was the BBC Forces program. That is, that they set up a radio station for the forces, for the army. Although, in fact, even more civilians than forces listened to it, and this is certainly because there was far more popular music and also far more request shows, if I understand correctly. So you can actually have messages to and from the sailors, and this forces program will become the basis for the post-war reorganization I will talk about next time into the light program, it will become the light program. The number of hours broadcasting for the forces was also extended, 12 hours a day. And there was some controversies about the kind of music played because the new style, the American crooners, Frank Sinatra and so on, were disapproved of by a section of the elite because they considered that it was rather feminine, and it was all men singing about having a broken heart. It was not very virile and soldierly, and there was a real debate going on about how this could be bad for our soldiers to listen to Frank Sinatra singing about his broken heart. This was taken very, very seriously. Meanwhile, in Britain, there was every day the radio program Calling All Workers, which was part of the program Music While You Work. It wasn't very long. I think it was half an hour long, but it was every day, and it was tremendously popular, and it was played in the factories. So this was the idea that now, far from popular music being something frowned on, it could help the war drive. It was played for the first time on the 23rd of June 1940, and in fact it was so popular that it will continue after the war until 1967. So there we go. What else do we have here? Yes, the BBC now, of course, is always trying to maintain something of a balance between popular light entertainment content and more intellectual content, which might not be as popular, but which the BBC leadership was felt good for people. Now, this debate has often been carried out in a rather stereotyped manner, and there are a number of examples of intellectually challenging content which turned out to be extremely popular. And a good example from the 1940s is the Brains Trust. It dealt with serious questions of art, science, and philosophy, and yet it drew millions of listeners. Up to a third of the UK population tuned in, and the programme received 3,000 to 4,000 letters a week. Just for 1 week, of course, most weeks the ordinary people sent in questions and the panel of experts replied to them. But just for 1 week in 1943, they switched things round and they had a panel of ordinary people, a soldier, a girl from the services, a housewife, a factory worker, and an entertainer. And they got experts to send in questions. So there's an interesting idea of switching it round for a day. Wartime also saw some extremely remarkable programs come about, and in 1942 you had the very first edition of Desert Island Discs, and this is a program I highly recommend. There is still one every week on the BBC, and it's an imaginary, it's a slightly humorous biographical program where they invite somebody who is either well-known or well-known in their field. So it might be a surgeon or an actor or a singer or a politician, not necessarily famous, but somebody who is well-known in their field. And they're asked to imagine that they're going to be stranded on a desert island and they can only take 8 songs with them. 8 songs, 1 book, and 1 luxury, the luxury having to be inanimate. Very easy to look up on the BBC podcast, and I do highly recommend it also for listening comprehension practice. So it's still continued today, and there have been more than 3,000 episodes. And another radio program from 1943, which lasted from 1943 and 1958, was Caribbean Voices, which basically got West Indian, that is to say Caribbean writers to talk about their work. And this was a very important program, and it helped to bring into prominence a number of writers, including Nepal, Walcott, Figueroa, and a few more, Salki, about whom I know very little, but 2 of them I'd heard of, so they must be quite well known. And that was just slightly longer than the other videos, but I've got basically to the end of the war, and not having given you too much details about the political side, because the political side of the BBC and the war and the Second World War, because that has been written about in many places, in particular in the article I recommended to you. So next time I will be moving on to then the BBC after 1945, and I will have a lot more of this exciting story to tell. Thank you for listening, and that's all for today. I just pressed this button. Mettre fin à la réunion.